So first and foremost, thank you very much for joining, Mr. Finkelstein. It's really an honor. I have been following you since forever. And for me, one of the best mic drops I've seen is in a YouTube video where you discuss this book with Dershowitz, I think he was named, where I'm really amazed by how you can remember everything, and you're basically telling him on page so and so this reference was debunked in 2006. It's really impressive, but you also talk about your force in this being the mastery of the detail. So I really enjoy this. I hope we can use this session to inform our audience about the history of Zionism and about anti-Semitism and how it played a role in the creation of Israel, but also talk about how they can correctly formulate a critique of what is happening without being afraid of being labeled as anti-Semites. But it will also be great to touch on the activist part of your career. I know you've been an activist since forever, and you've probably seen a number of approaches. It would be great to get some advices for our young audience in regards to what opportunities are there to engage and so on. But first, if we can talk about Zionism, if you can set the stage for us and tell us what Zionism is and what it isn't.
Well, let me begin by saying that personally, I don't believe Zionism is a useful term to try to understand the nature of the conflict today and the dynamics of the conflict today. If I can use an analogy, I don't think any serious student of contemporary China would want to try to understand contemporary China by looking at Marxism, Leninism, or looking at Maoism. Now, as you know, even today, when China is the leading edge of international capitalism, it still officially calls itself Marxist-Leninist. And hanging in Tiananmen Square is a giant portrait of Chairman Mao Zedong. But the fact that a government officially calls itself X or Y, in the case of Israel, Zionist, in the case of China, Marxist-Leninist, and also Mao Zedong thought, does not necessarily mean, it can mean, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these ideologies are particularly useful, or an analysis of these ideologies is particularly useful in trying to understand the society or its dynamics. However, it's also true that historically, yes, of course, Zionism played a role in the creation of the state of Israel. And I'm here to try to give some historical background. And in that regard, yes, Zionism is quite important. Now, I wouldn't say quite important, but it would be important. I wouldn't say very important, but it would be important in trying to understand the dynamics of the history of the conflict. So Zionism emerges at the end of the 19th century. Usually it's dated around 1880. Some people say 1881, 1882, when Europe is confronted with, or I should say, Jews are confronted with a situation in Europe which is sometimes called the Jewish question. And the Jewish question, like there was a woman question, there was a class question. In the United States, there was a Negro question. It referred to the dynamics or the situation of a particular group of people which didn't fit into some general or generic scheme. And the Jews formed a question. And the issue comes down to really two things. Jews suffered a particular form of persecution that was directed against Jews. So, first of all, where does this persecution come from? That was a big question. What are the roots of this persecution? And secondly, once you've analyzed the roots of the persecution, the source of the communication, of the persecution, the origins of the persecution, the next question is, then what's the solution? And different groups of Jews came up with different analyses of the source of the persecution, and then came up with different solutions to the problem. And some Jews came to the conclusion that the problem was capitalism, that capitalism was the root, the source, the origin of the persecution of the Jews and also of everybody else. For some people, it was capitalism. Eliminate capitalism and these special problems, the woman question, the Negro question, the Jewish question, they would all be eliminated if we can solve the class question. That was the thinking. Solve the class question, and you solve all the other questions. There is a thread in Marxism, which you can find from his earliest works, the works of Karl Marx, in which he says all human oppression, all human oppressions, the different kinds of oppression, they are all embodied in the oppression of the proletariat. That the kinds of human oppression across the board, they are condensed in the proletariat. So if you solve the oppression of the proletariat, the working class, then you've solved all human oppression. Many Jews, incidentally, were drawn to that idea. Not a majority, but quite a few. Now, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, he once said, it is actually true to say Jews made the Russian Revolution. Nowadays, that's sometimes considered anti-Semitism because of very let's just say very chauvinist Russians like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous writer. Solzhenitsyn, he did believe Jews made the Russian Revolution, but in his view, that was a terrible fact. And people accused Solzhenitsyn of being an anti-Semite for saying Jews made the Russian Revolution. That was his view. But for people on the left who were Jewish, that was a source of pride. If you, with the partial exception of Lenin, because there is some debate whether Lenin was 1/4 Jewish or not. I don't know. I find that I don't really accept it, but there's some debate. With the partial exception of Lenin and Stalin, all the leaders of the Russian Revolution were Jewish. Every single one. Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, you just go down the line. They're all Jewish. So one group of Jews was attracted to the Marxist vision of if we eliminate capitalism and we create what's called a classless society, we will solve all the other human oppressions. Without going through all the other permutations and combinations, let's just get to the Zionists. The Zionist view basically was that Jews constituted a nation. They were not just a religious group, they were a nationality. And, continued the Zionists, in the normal state of things, every nation has its own state. So the Zionists reasoned that wherever Jews lived, they were aliens in those areas because the French state belonged to the French people, the German state belonged to the German people, the British state belonged to the British people. Every people had its own state. And it was because Jews were intrinsically alien to all the other states in the world. They didn't really care about the world, they cared about Europe. So even though I say world, they're really talking about Europe. Because Jews were alien to all the other states, there is, and here Sana's knowledge of science is useful, they said a body politic is like a human body. A human body repels aliens, alien presences. That's how our immune system works. It repels alien presences. So the Zionist view was Jews were an alien presence in Europe as a whole, but in particular in each nation state, they were an alien. And therefore, the body politic, as against the human body, the body politic is repelling this alien presence. And that's what they said anti-Semitism was. And so in their view, anti-Semitism was not an abnormality. It was not something that you should fight, because in their view, it was as natural and as normal as alien bodies in the human body are repelled by our immune system. And from that analysis of the Jewish question, they reached the conclusion the only way you can solve the Jewish question is not by fighting anti-Semitism, but creating a state for the Jews. And in a state for the Jews, the natural process of repulsion would not occur, obviously. And therefore, for the Zionist idea, the natural state is one in which each state, and in the case of the Jews, the Jewish state, is just for Jews. That's ideally, just like the German state is ideally a homogeneous German state. Each nation has its own state. That's how they envisaged it. The other question is, because I said once you pose a question in a certain way, the Jewish Marxists saw it as a class question. The Zionists saw it as a nation question. It was a problem of nationality. The second obvious question is, where? Where is this state supposed to be? And in Europe at the time, there was an ideology. It's still very popular. None of these ideas are new. I'm just showing you how it was applied in the Zionist question. There was an idea that every state should be located in the place of origin of its people, what we would now call their historic homeland. So France was the historic homeland of the French people, and there was all these ideologies about roots and a special or unique interaction between each people and its ancestral soil, its ancestral homeland. The Nazis, or the precursors of the Nazis, they used the expression, which became quite popular, of Blut und Boden, blood and soil. So people of the same blood, let's call it Germanic blood, should be rooted in the German soil. Blut und Boden. The general ideology is called German Romanticism. But the German Romanticism was very pervasive in Europe. It wasn't just Germans. In France, it was called integral nationalism. Integral meaning a whole. The French people should be in the French soil. Well, you can already figure it out. You don't need rocket science to figure it out. The Zionists thought then the natural place for their historic homeland should be Palestine, where the Jewish people originated. So that was, in a nutshell, the ideology. Now, as you can imagine, again, it doesn't take knowledge of particle physics. You can imagine the problem was, well, the French were already in France. The Germans were already in Germany. But the Jews were not in Palestine. So now a new problem arises. Okay, if you think the proper relationship between each nationality and its homeland is for them to go to where they originated, well, Palestine is already, there are people there on the one hand, and more importantly, the land belonged to other people. Either, if you want to see it as belonging to the indigenous population, or if you want to see it as the current so-called owners of the land, in this case being the Ottoman Empire. And the question then is, how do you square the circle? How do you get the Jews into their homeland? And that's where, in my view, it ceases to be a question only of Zionism, and then it becomes a question of the ethos of the late 19th century. The late 19th century is called the era of the new imperialism, where the European countries are, its main manifestation is what's called the scramble for Africa, where the European countries are gobbling up Africa, but it also includes, obviously, the Middle East. And at this point, not because it was part of Zionist ideology, but because of practical, pragmatic considerations, the Zionists couldn't achieve their goal of a Jewish state in Palestine without participating in that new imperialism. In this case, eventually, though that was purely by chance, the Zionists tried to create a relationship with the Turks, with the Germans, with the French. They're looking around for an imperialist sponsor. Now, you have to remember, I'm not making any apologies, I'm just trying to speak factually. At that time, it wasn't looked at as something, nefarious, something evil. It was the era of the new imperialism, and so the Zionist movement was looking for an imperialist sponsor in order to create its state in Palestine. There was nothing unusual about that. Nobody saw, oh, the evil Zionists are trying to control Palestine. No, they looked around for an imperial sponsor. The imperialists are everywhere at this point, what were called back then. And incidentally, it wasn't a pejorative term. It wasn't a negative term to be an imperialist. Most of them, Cecil Rhodes would say, of course I'm an imperialist, and what's wrong with that? It's only later that it got negative connotations. Even I would guess, when a lot of the Marxists wrote pamphlets or little books on imperialism, everybody knows Lenin's famous Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, but I don't think he used the term as a negative. It was just descriptive. If you understand the difference, it was just describing a phenomenon called imperialism, but it wasn't a negative connotation. In any event, and that began the entanglement between Zionism and imperialism, and that culminated, I don't think we have time now, I'm going to stop here because I want to give you a chance to talk, and that culminated in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when the British, or Her Majesty's, or His Majesty's government, looks with favor upon the founding of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so the only point, there are many points here, and you can ask me questions on any of them, but for our purposes, for me, one of the important points is that I don't think Zionism had much to do in terms of its ideology with imperialism or capitalism. Zionism was just one version of a kind of ethnic nationalism all over Europe. This is what I called, as I said, the romantic nationalism. Each people should have its own state, and the state should be located in the place of origin of that people. That was a very popular idea back then. It's still, obviously, it has its resonance today. We call it the principle of self-determination of peoples. Each people has a right to its own state. The tough part of that particular formulation is what constitutes a people? And that's been the hardest question in this whole theory of self-determination. So I live in Brooklyn, New York, and Brooklyn people have a certain chauvinism about our little borough. So are Brooklyn people, Brooklynites, are they a people? Are they entitled to self-determination? Well, some people will say that's crazy. You're just one borough of 5 in New York. So we say, okay, fair enough. So do New Yorkers, are they a people? Do they have the right to self-determination? And on and on. So now you could say, I'm in New York State. Okay, I have a New York State chauvinism. Does each state constitute a people? And should New York State have the right to self-determination? And the same question arose with the Zionists. Do they constitute a people? Are they entitled to self-determination as a people? So that was one question. And then the second question is where? Where are they entitled to the self-determination? There was another group of Jews called the Bundists. The Bundists said Jews constitute a cultural group, and so they're entitled to cultural autonomy or self-determination. So they did not say each nation should get its own state. They said each cultural group should have the right to some kind of autonomy within a state. And everybody's familiar with that. You know, that idea, for example, plays itself out in Spain, where the different, you can call them nationalities, cultural groups, are looking for self-determination, whereas others are looking for independent statehood. And so the question arises, which cultural groups are entitled to autonomy, but not statehood? Where do you draw the line? Okay, I think the Catalans are entitled to cultural autonomy, but I don't think they're entitled to statehood. Same thing with the other groups in Spain. There was a big issue of that in Canada. Do the Quebecois, are they entitled to statehood or just cultural autonomy? Now, bear in mind, even cultural autonomy is a question. Are you just a citizen of the state, or do you constitute a cultural group entitled to autonomy? Or do you constitute a state entitled to self-determination? None of these questions are obvious. None of them are obvious. They're all, from a theoretical point of view, very murky, very unclear. And from a practical point of view, in my opinion, well, we can argue about it. All of this talk about Palestinians are a people, and therefore they're entitled to self-determination, and self-determination includes the right to a state. The fact is, these definitions don't really have much content. It really is all politics. The Palestinians did not win the right to self-determination and statehood because, according to some dictionary, they constituted a people, and as a people, they're entitled to the right of self-determination, and self-determination entitles them to the right to a state. It doesn't really work. They fought, they struggled, and they had a lot of backing. They had the backing of the Arab world for that particular demand. For that particular demand, they had the backing of a strong regional bloc. And because they had that political power behind them, they won the right to be recognized as a people, and therefore having the right of self-determination, and therefore a state. It was not intrinsic or to the nature of the Palestinian people, because as I've tried to suggest, for all I know, people in Brooklyn are a people. I mean, how do you prove it's not? Listen, Brooklyn has 2 million people, which means it's bigger than quite a lot of states in the world. That's just a fact. It has a larger population than a large number of states in the world. There are states in the world which have a population that can fit in my living room. Why is Nauru a state? Why is Palau a state? Why are any of the Gulf states states? What makes them states? Is Bahrain a state? Is the UAE a state? Believe me, I've been studying this for years. As somebody said very nicely, thank you very much, forever. I've been studying this. I still can't figure out Abu Dhabi, UAE, Qatar. I don't know what the hell they are. I don't know if they're the capital cities. I don't know if they're the states. I really don't. I'll be honest with you. And the point is, how did they earn the title of a people endowed with the right to a state? It was politics. The European countries took gas stations, and instead of calling them Sunoco or Mobil Oil, they called them Qatar, UAE. There's no theoretical
okay, so I feel this is really interesting, and I'd love to dive more into that. But I think it would be interesting as well to discuss what constitutes the right of the Palestinians, but also how did starting with that, how did the Zionist movement win the trust of the British? How did they get the support they needed? First the British, afterwards the Americans, and how did they address what was called the Arab question? Because coming out of discussing the Jew question came the Arab question as well.
Let me make a suggestion at this point. It's just a recommendation. You might choose for me to just go chronologically from beginning to end, but in that case, people are going to forget a lot of what I said along the way. So we have two choices. You can proceed and me just go through the whole history, or to take pauses after each segment. I'm leading off right now at the origins of the Zionist movement to the Balfour Declaration. That's usually one period. And I raised a lot of issues, and maybe we could just take a brief digression of maybe 10 minutes where you can put questions to me, and then I'll go to the second phase, whichever you prefer. I'm indifferent.
Let's do that. I think that would be a good way to get questions from everybody as well, and okay. I think it would be easier to work with that. So the floor, anybody who has questions to the part we had. Mark, you raised your hand, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Norman Finkelstein was very informative. I remember the question that Moody brought to you, and it was also, what is Zionism not? Because, and the second part of my question is, you started out telling us that, is it Zionism that we actually are talking about, or is it something else because it has been modified through history and it's a different cause now? I understand that. Then firstly, what should we call it now to describe what's going on? Which kind of ideology are we talking about? And secondly, what is it not? Because we think it's very important for our organization to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Well, what is Zionism and what is it not? I would say Zionism has, in its origins, it had two essential components. Ideologically, it was a form of German Romanticism, this ideology of every nation or every people should have its own independent state. That was Zionism. Then I would say Zionism got intertwined historically, and basically it became inseparable from the phenomenon of late 19th century European imperialism, because Zionism could not realize its objective. It didn't have armies. It didn't have money. No rich Jew. There were a few rich Jews as a charitable thing, supported the Zionist undertaking in Palestine. But as a general rule, most Jews were not interested in Palestine. They were concerned with the countries, they had money, the countries in which they lived. And so their money, to the extent that they had, and there were Jews who were rich even, pre-World War II, their attention was fixed on their own countries. So it was a poor movement, and it was had no power, and you couldn't conquer a place like Palestine, which was coveted by all the imperial powers for different reasons. Palestine was coveted by all the imperial powers. The British wanted Palestine because it was the northern flank of the Suez Canal, to protect the Suez Canal. The British also wanted Palestine because it was called one step along the land bridge to India. So Palestine played a role there. The French wanted Palestine, the Germans wanted Palestine for different reasons. So it was a coveted place, a desired place. There was no way the Zionists could win it unless they had imperial backing. It couldn't happen. So it became intertwined with imperialism, and it never separated. I mean, that became a constant of Zionism when it became a state. When it became a state after the Zionist project was realized, because the Zionist movement, it never believed the Arab world would accept them. It kind of internalized the idea that it was alien to the Arab world. And they, I think that's still a factor. Their main trading partner is the EU, and they see themselves as part of the West. Now, that doesn't mean a large part of the population came from the East, what's called the Sephardic Jews. But they see themselves as alien to the Arab world, and they see it as they'll never be accepted by the Arab world. And so it was a unifying theme in Zionist ideology after statehood by people like David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. The Arab world will never accept us. We need a solid Western supporter, preferably the whole West, but it's not going to happen. So originally, during the creation of the State of Israel, it was the British. Then it became, after the State of Israel, became the French. And then after the 1967 war, of course, it became the Americans. So this entwinement with imperialism, it started from, as I say, in my opinion, with the Balfour Declaration and that problem of how do you create a state in an area which is not Jewish. So it begins as a kind of German Romanticism, then it becomes entwined with imperialism. However, we can argue over these things, disagree over them, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think the State of Israel today has anything whatever to do with Zionism anymore. What it is it's a racist, Jewish supremacist state, which which desires power and influence, and all the so-called theory of Zionism is completely alien to these people. They're basically, like many heads of state, they're just basically hoodlums and thugs who are trying to aggrandize, increase the power of their state. And they're also Jewish supremacists and racists who see the Arabs as an alien presence. In that respect, they're Zionists, of course. But on the other hand, there are many states that carry on that way, which are not, you wouldn't call them Zionist, They're the alt-right, who don't like foreigners, who don't like immigrants, who don't like Arabs, who don't like Muslims. Would you say Modi in India is a Zionist because he hates Muslims? Would you say the Hungarian regime is Zionist, even though it loves Israel, but it hates immigrants? It doesn't have much to do with Zionism anymore, in my view. The founding generation, as is true of most regimes, the founding generation were true believers, yes. People like Ben-Gurion is a Zionist, no question about it. Or Jabotinsky, he's a Zionist. They fervently believe in this ideology, which made them idealists. They were out for an idea. They coveted power, no question. They were focused on power, but it is true to say, in my opinion, it was not power for power's sake, like someone like Netanyahu. It was power in pursuit of an ideal. They were driven by an ideal. Standard of living, very simple, austere. You could say many things about these people. I'm willing to go with you there. But to say they were corrupt, not really. Corrupt in the material sense, not really. Did they have secret Swiss bank accounts? Not really. Did they go on shopping sprees in Paris? Not really. They were devoted to the cause. Those were the founding generation. Same thing, by the way, in the Soviet Union. But once you get entrenched in power, and then the realities of holding power and preserving your state, they take precedence over the ideology. The ideology becomes a kind of facade for other things. And so Zionism is just a facade in the case of Israel, just as in China, Marxism-Leninism is just a facade, as it is, by the way, in North Korea. I mean, if you think about it, North Korea calls itself Marxist-Leninist. Could you imagine what Marx would think if he came back and he saw that regime and calling itself Marxist-Leninist? That's crazy. It's crazy. Do you think the head of state of North Korea, he reads Marxist theses on Feuerbach? Does he read Das Kapital at night? I mean,
these are the good questions. The good questions.
The whole thing is completely laughable. I don't know why people are so emphatic that that same reality applies to Israel. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, the term Zionism was in Israel. In Israel, it was the subject of mockery. So if somebody would start talking about some stupid thing, they would say, "Stop with your Zionism." You know, meaning stop with your nonsense. Because it was just thought of as a ridiculous, discredited ideology. What does it have to do with us now? Stop with your Zionism. And the funny thing is, the stupid left, and I hear with great emphasis on Palestinian left, the stupid Palestinian left debate and want to talk about something which is just transparently nonsense and beside the point. And they think if you don't want to talk about it, you're somehow trying to evade it because you're a liberal Zionist. No, you don't want to talk about it because it's irrelevant. I've read more on Zionism than Mr. Netanyahu's entire cabinet. I have. Nobody reads that stuff. You think they've read Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State? You know, when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism. So I thought, okay, I have now to read the Jewish State. And I thought it was a thick tome, you know, like, because I read Marx's Volume 1 of Capital 4 times. It's a fat book. I read volumes 2 and 3, and they're not easy. I read each of them twice. So I figure, you know what Herzl's Jewish State is? It's like 40 pages. It's completely nutty. Nobody reads it. And that's considered the founding text, the Jewish State. Nobody reads it. It has nothing to do with their thinking. And that's why it's so ridiculous. You said, but they hate Arabs. Yeah, they hate Arabs. So what does that have to do with Zionism? A lot of white people hate black people. Is that Zionism? No. It's just racism, in this case, Jewish supremacy. By the way, the Israelis don't just hate Arabs. They hate everybody who's not Jewish. They think they're all stupid.
But it like if we have two questions, but I do understand why it's difficult to deal with, especially considering how much effort that has been put into labeling every critic of Israel as a Zionist, as an anti-Semite, and we have to be very careful with our words. So I hope, Mark, that Mereke, that you got an answer. But we have a hand raised from Mahmoud, and we have a question from Bilal.
I would just want to say, first of all, it's not an easy question, because Israel's army, and here I include a large number of Jews in powerful places, they are very much on the offensive right now, and they're trying to ban any criticism of Israel, and unfortunately they're winning. It's becoming a very sorry state what's happening in the US, in the UK in particular. I follow them both. They're very much on the offensive, trying to get any criticism of Israel labeled anti-Semitism, getting it into college administrative rules all over the place. Very big problem. So I'm not going to deny the existence of that problem. And I'm not going to pretend there's any simple solution to it. These people, they are a gang of thugs, and they are really on the offensive now. It's just breathtaking what's going on in the UK right now, where the current government is forcing, literally saying every university has to pass this rule saying any criticism of Israel, in effect, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, or we're going to strip you of any government funds. And they gave the universities until Christmas to decide either adopt what's called the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism, which includes criticism of Israel, or else. And they've laid it out, or else you're going to lose all government funding. So far, Cambridge and Oxford have resisted. And they're putting a lot of pressure now on Cambridge and Oxford. About 22. Well, yesterday Warwick capitulated, so now it's 23. 23 universities and colleges have capitulated. But they're aiming now because they know if they can break the kneecaps of Cambridge and Oxford, it's over. Everybody else will fall into line. So there's no question there's a real problem here with using the label of anti-Semitism in order to silence all criticism of Israel. However, you don't make it easy for the other side. That's the thing. You don't make it easy for them. Why talk about these murky things like Zionism, which are basically meaningless now, and not talk about concrete things? You could say, we don't support a state that discriminates against a portion of its citizens based on nationality. Or we don't support a racist state. Those to me are clear statements which people can debate. So of course the Zionists or Jewish supporters of Israel, they'll say, why are you calling Israel a racist state? Okay, fine. Then you come forward. And you start going, you start looking at the legislation, you look at the Jewish nation bill. How would you like it in the United States if we had a Christian nation bill? And then you have to say, well, you know, folks, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza since 1967. So that's, it's more than a half century. So it really is part of Israel at this point. And those people have no rights at all. So that sounds pretty racist to me, when an entire population, which is, if they're Jewish, they have all rights, even if the settlements are right in the middle of Palestine or the West Bank, they're right in the middle and they have rights, but the Jews who are right around them and inside them, they have, I should say, the Palestinians who are right around them and inside them, they have no rights. That sounds pretty racist to me. So yeah, I think it is a racist state, and then let's argue. But when you say they're Zionists, you just make it easy. Because what is Zionism? It's nothing concrete which any broad public can understand. It doesn't mean anything. So I think the best way to argue is to focus on things which a broad public understands and makes sense to them. I'm not saying it's going to win, because right now it's very tough. I have never seen quite what's going on now. This juggernaut of Jewish organizations who are pushing so hard to immunize Israel from any criticism on the ground that it's anti-Semitism, but I don't see why you should make it easier for them. And I think the way to do it is to use language which is concrete and which they will have trouble answering.
I think this is very useful for our crowd, definitely, to bring it down to something tangible, something concrete, and drive away from all the dates and the names, which I also noticed that you did in your framing of the Zionist history. We have a question from Bilal, and it is the reason why you do not see Israel today as Zionist because that the Israeli people or the government are not as idealist as the Israelis were in 1948. And the second part of the question, isn't implementing the settlement project driven by the Zionist ideology? And then there's a question for Mahmoud. He has had his hand raised for a couple of minutes. So Mahmoud, go ahead.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And I think it was very interesting to hear that from you, Mr. Norman. And I have a question for you that you already came on. And it was all like what you talked about with the countries that in Europe, for example, that have the same, maybe the same ideology as Israel for now. And do you see some parallels between the European nationalism today and their power and how Israel is working on with putting all this censorship on criticizing them?
Well, look, there is an alt-right, and it's a global alt-right, and it's a real problem. It's a definite menace. It clearly is an echo, and more than an echo, of the struggles of the 1930s, which also occurred during an economic breakdown. There was a fascist and there was an anti-fascist movement. There was an international fascism. It wasn't so much, it existed elsewhere, but it was basically a European phenomenon, obviously. And there was an anti-fascism. And now we have an alt-right, which is on the offensive. And we have a pretty weak international left, or you could say anti-fascist. There were two hopeful signs for a period. Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Bernie Sanders in the United States. And they represented real social forces, but they were pretty easily defeated. The alt-right, it includes everyone from Modi in India, that's quite a lot of people, Duterte in the Philippines, places like Hungary, Brazil, Bolsonaro, United States. We'll see what happens next week, but as of now, the United States and Israel is part of that alt-right. The most, not for everybody, but for me, the most interesting thing is the alt-right in Eastern Europe. It includes a lot of anti-Semitic regimes. They're solidly anti-Semitic. They trace their roots back, in Hungary, to somebody like Horthy, Admiral Horthy, who was an anti-Semite in the interwar period. And the new regime wants to traces itself back, the current regime, to Horthy. Why do they? But they love Israel. They love Israel, and that's an interesting fact. They love Israel, even though Israel is a Jewish state, for two reasons. One, it does have to do with Israel being Jewish, because the alt-right does believe Jews have a lot of power, economic power, political power, and they figure in order to get into the good graces of the United States, the White House, you should get the Jews on your side. So they like Israel for that. They figure Israel is both the wire puller, pulling the wires of the puppet in the United States, but also as the entranceway, the path to the United States. In part, it's true. We shouldn't, kid ourselves about that. Israel has a big lobby, so it tells these governments, it tells like or Bahrain, you get in good with us, and we're going to get you, a meeting with Trump, and they can't do that. So this notion of Jewish power, no, they don't control the world, but it is true. Jews have money. Jews are well organized. That's all true. And they're a powerful lobby, or can be when they want to be. But the second reason, actually, in my opinion, the main reason, that is a consideration for sure. The main reason is Israel's what they all want to be. Israel is a white supremacist, Jewish supremacist state. It's a militarized state. It hates immigrants, not just Arabs. It hates Africans. Get these people out of here. The African immigrants hates immigrants. Israel resembles the perfect alt-right state, militaristic, racist, powerful. And so the irony is, in their minds, Israel's not Jewish. Israel is not a Jewish state, because historically, when you thought of Jews, you take the 1930s, yes, there was a group who the stereotype was the Jewish financier, the Rothschilds or whoever. Yes, there was that group. And there was also the Jewish revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Jew. And the rest were kind of scrawny Jews, meaning they weren't strong, they weren't powerful in the militaristic, physical sense. That was not Jewish. It was not Jewish at all. If you want to know what the Jewish stereotype was, it's a Woody Allen type. If you know who yes, it's true. That's Woody Allen is what you would call a typical Jew. The horn-rimmed glasses, kind of cerebral, a little bit bohemian, kooky, that was a Jew. And so for Israel was a very strange phenomenon. You take the 1967 war, along comes this guy named Moshe Dayan. He's got a patch. He looks like a pirate. Jews aren't pirates. That's not a Jewish thing. If you want to say Jews, they read books, yeah, but Jews are not pirates. And now Israel has become even though it's a Jewish state, from the point of view of classical Jews, it's a completely un-Jewish state. My late mother, who was a very smart person, extremely smart, she would be very insistent the Israelis are not Jews. She would say they're all CIA agents. She really believed it. Those are not Jews. Jews don't go around killing people. I'm serious. I mean, you may not like to hear it, but you really couldn't conceive the idea of a Jew killing a baby. You couldn't. Could you imagine, Sana? Now, I know you don't agree with anything I'm saying, and you're probably going to tune out this broadcast any minute. You're going to pull the plug. But, Sana, are you there, Sana? I'm not sure. Are you there?
I'm listening.
Could you imagine Woody Allen in Gaza, along the periphery, killing Jewish children?
But this is happening, Norman.
Yes, of course it's happening. But my point is, it's paradoxical that the alt-right loves Israel, even though large parts of the alt-right are fanatically anti-Semitic, and it's because they don't see Israel as Jewish. They don't see it. They see it as just an ideal white supremacist state. That's how they see it.
So to sum up, like, Israel isn't Zionist anymore, and even the basis of it, maybe the idea, the initial idea and the reason for the Aliyahs, the migration, was based on the Judenist state. It's not Zionist and it's not Jewish either.
It depends on what you mean by Jewish. We don't want to get carried away. I said that the countries which support the state of Israel don't see it as a Jewish state. They see it as an ideal alt-right state. But there are large numbers of Jewish fanatics in Israel, and even, you could say, moderate Jewish fanatics, in the sense that, if you read, for example, recent coverage of what's going on, now it's the grape harvest, olive harvest in Palestine. And you read these Jews, complete thugs, lunatics. They go, they throw, they beat the Palestinians, and they say, God gave this land to us. So they really believe this is their land. God gave it to us. Is that Zionism? I don't know. I think of it as just Jewish fanaticism. Crazy Jews. I don't know what we could disagree over that, but I don't know what it has to do with Zionist ideology. I mean, it's like...
No, I respect that, and we will bring it with us. I think in respect for the time.
Anything that the current Chinese leadership does that has to do with Marxism-Leninism. And to me, it's the same thing with Israel. I spend a lot of time trying to analyze Israeli behavior, trying to understand what they're going to do next. Take a very smart Arab leader, the only smart Arab leader, Said Nasrallah. Do you think when Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, do you think when he's trying to figure out what Israel is going to do next in Syria or in the Golan or against Iran or in Lebanon, do you think he analyzes their Zionist thinking? I don't think so. I think he tries to understand the dynamics of Israeli politics, in particular its leadership, and it's completely understandable without ever having read a single book on Zionism. It's completely understandable. When I try to analyze Netanyahu, what's he trying to do now? What's the government trying to do? I don't think about Zionism. That doesn't help me very much in trying to understand it. Am I wrong, Sana?
I see we have two hands raised. One from
I can't see anything, so okay.
Yeah. No, but I think this is very important. I am obsessed with Zionism because the history of it, and because reading Theodor Herzl, if you switch out Jew with Muslim, you're kind of reading into the situation of Muslims in Europe today. So you could easily rewrite it, simply search and replace that. But I think I'll give the word to Mark.
I wouldn't say that's quite right, because I don't see any movement among Muslims to try to create a state of their own in Europe. Muslims are more in another kind, if we can use the word, they're in another kind of conversation. And the conversation is closer to places like Spain or Canada. How do you preserve your cultural identity within another state? They're not talking about leaving. How do you preserve your cultural identity within another state and also respect the obligations of citizenship? How do you navigate that? We want to be French. However, we want to preserve our customs, including our holidays, our family values, important. We want to preserve our family values, our religious values, and we also want to be full citizens of the state. How do you do that? That wasn't really Zionist at all. The Zionist was, we're packing our bags when we get our state and we're leaving. We don't want to figure out, we don't think we'll ever be accepted here. We don't think we can ever be fully Jews here. So we don't have any plan to stay here. So I wouldn't call it Zionist. I would say it's a typical problem in Europe now of how do you find a point of reconciliation, or the Latin term they use, a modus vivendi, a way of living together in a state which you want citizenship, but not at the price of having to give up your religious and cultural values. And as I said, those are tough questions. Those are very tough questions, but I wouldn't say those are Zionist questions.
Mark, do you have a question?
I have a lot of questions, but I'll have to select. Well, first of all, I think I don't want to dwell in this Zionist question too much longer, because we have some other topics to discuss. But the reason why we would like to dwell in it is because we see it as grassroots organizations. We have to deal with people in a simple manner, and we have to have some words to describe, some simple words to describe this conflict and this analogy, and we have to call it something. Now, you say that Zionist, it's not appropriate. It's not an appropriate word to describe what's going on. I agree, after I heard your very detailed, into the depth explanation of why. But the reason why we still continue using this word is because I know in the Balfour Declaration, it says that the Jews must have a state by any means necessary. And
no,
it doesn't say that?
No, it doesn't even come close to saying that. Okay. First of all, the Balfour Declaration, it was the result of a huge amount of lobbying, arguing, disputing among different branches of the British government. And within each branch, members of each branch of the British government, they never used the word state in the Balfour Declaration. They used the word homeland.
Homeland.
And it says, we look with favor upon the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, that was a very key preposition, in. It meant not the whole of Palestine, in Palestine. Everything in the Balfour Declaration was very carefully chosen. Now, I'm not saying that in the back of some people's minds, this was going to be a Jewish state. Yes, that was the back of some people's minds, actually quite a lot of people's minds. But that's not what the Declaration said.
Okay, and as a grassroots, working from Denmark,
Mm-hmm.
our target is to have the Danish government, first of all, to recognize the state of Palestine. I mean, ultimately, we would like the Danish government to put consequences, embargo on Israel until it lives up to the world law. Now, do you have any suggestions to how for us to get there? Is this the right target? Are we, I mean, do you have any strategies that you could say this would work good if you went for this?
Well, I think at this point, I just have to ask you people what you would like to discuss. The question of strategies and what to do now will take us from the Balfour Declaration, which is 1917, to 2020. So that means we're going to skip about a century. Now, if you would like to do that, that's fine with me. And we could just jump to the present. As a general rule, I think not how you began, but where you ended up, to me, that's the right strategy. That is to say, you have to be sensitive to the era in which you live, the epoch in which you live, the times in which you live. If you're in the 1970s and 1980s, and I know I've been around forever, so that includes those decades. Yeah, those decades, Sana's much younger than me, but she has some vague memory. Those are the eras of the national liberation movements, of the Third World. International law, I can tell you, because I lived through that era. International law was not part of our vocabulary. You know, our vocabulary was national liberation, wars of aggression. The U.S. was waging a war of aggression in Vietnam. You'll be surprised, perhaps, to learn Vietnam, which was the decisive movement of my generation, never once came up in the United Nations. It did not come up in the UN. The U.S. would not allow it. The Security Council never debated the war in Vietnam. U Thant, who was Secretary General, he was and he was a very decent guy, extremely decent guy. I liked U Thant. He's the only UN Secretary General I've ever liked. He would quietly say things about the war in Vietnam. He was very good on Israel-Palestine. He was honest. He wasn't an ideologue. He was a school teacher. And he conducted himself like a school teacher. He was very religious Buddhist. The weekends, when UN work was over, he got back into his Buddhist garb. And he was honest. I liked him. The Israelis hated him because he was honest. He said, you know, he knew the Israelis because he didn't know them intimately, but he knew them in the UN. They were they're thugs. So in that era, you could ignore international law. It just didn't come up. I have a very vivid memory of it. Incidentally, there were no human rights organizations back then. You know, things like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. Amnesty had gotten started, but it was totally irrelevant. It was the first human rights organization, but totally irrelevant. Nobody talked about it. Human Rights Watch didn't come around until the 1980s, early 1980s. Let me just remember, was it 80 or 1990s? No, it was, yeah, it was 1990s. So during that era, our language was different. Our language was different. But as you said before, in the midway in your conversation, you suddenly start to talk about world law, you said, international law. That's correct. That's the language, whether you like it or not. That's the language of our era, of our epoch. It's the language of human rights, of international law. And you have to adjust to and accommodate that. Now, the human rights organizations, sometimes they can be very good, sometimes they can be very bad. But one thing there's in common. One thing there's a common denominator. On its best days or its worst days, you can enter the word Zionism in Human Rights Watch's main website, the search function, enter Zionism. It will never come up. They don't use that language. Now, you might say it's cowardly that they don't use that language. Cowardly is probably part of it. I'm not going to doubt that. But the main fact is two things. Number one, you can say the same things that you want to say without saying the word Zionism. If you want to say Israel is a racist state, so just say Israel is a racist state. Why bring in Zionism? Why start with Zionism is racism? You could just use the language. You can make your point. You can make your point without using that language. And number two, among normal people, which is a very broad spectrum, it's not used anymore. So what's the point of denouncing a phenomenon which means nothing to anybody? Now, I see all of these enraged Palestinian leftists, we want to denounce Zionism, Zionism about everything, Zionism is behind this, behind that. You're not talking to anybody. Do you think most people care about Zionism? Do you think they have any idea what it is? Do you think they're really interested? But if you say, here are these people and they're stealing our land day by day. They're just, not literally, physically, they're just stealing our land. There are these people who are just trying to harvest their olives, and they're beset upon by these lunatic Jews, and I know you're not allowed to say Jews, so you'll say lunatic Israelis, who say that that land belongs to them because God gave it to them. Well, for most people, that sounds pretty crazy. That sounds pretty crazy. So use that language, use those descriptions that mean something, rather than say, these crazy Zionists. What does that mean?
Related to that, and maybe Bilal should have an opportunity to ask his question as well. So one thing is the vocabulary, the other thing is the ask. So Mark said that the initial thing in Denmark is the recognition of Palestine. Is that the right strategy, or should we aid the battle against the? Well, should we help the universities in England? Is that a fight that we should go in instead? And Bilal, you have a question, and I hope it's okay we pool these questions.
Well, first of all, I said the language of the day, of the era, of the epoch, for better or for worse, it has its good sides, it has its bad sides. A lot of international law is very questionable, in my opinion. So it's not the greatest body of law. I teach international law. I teach the laws of war. What's called the laws of war are completely insane. They are. Under the laws of war, there's a thing called the dum-dum bullet. You know what a dum-dum bullet is? It's an explosive bullet. It enters your body and then it explodes. So in 1899, the international community says, that's a terrible, terrible thing, a dum-dum bullet, because you've already disabled the combatant. So why add, the expression is, to the combatant's unnecessary suffering by having the bullet explode inside you. So, oh, terrible, terrible. We've got to ban dum-dum bullets. Okay, that sounds fair. A nuclear bomb can kill 100 million people in the blink of an eye. Can kill 100 million people in the blink of an eye. And the International Court of Justice can't agree whether that should be illegal. You can have a dum-dum bullet causes unnecessary suffering to one person. Terrible, horrible, violates what they call the laws of war, the humanitarian laws of war. It's called IHL, International Humanitarian Law. But then the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it has to rule in 1996, are nuclear weapons illegal? Because they can wipe out a whole continent in the blink of an eye. It's a very tough question. We have to search very deeply into the law to resolve this question. You know, the law is crazy. It's completely laughable, but parts of it are okay. And that brings us back to your question. After a long struggle, and you know, Sana, you have to admit facts. I'll admit, as much as I loathed Yasser Arafat, I didn't like the guy at all. Thought he was a complete disgrace to the Palestinian people, because there are so many people who are smarter than him, who spoke English better than him and spoke Arabic a lot better than him. But facts are facts. During that phase of the Palestinian struggle, through all of his maneuvering and all of his manipulations, he did succeed as the leader, not on his own, but he did succeed in turning a refugee question into a question of self-determination and won the right to statehood. That phase of the movement. It was an achievement of that phase of the movement. It's a fact. And once that's been achieved, and that's the language of international community, of the international community now, peoplehood, statehood, or I should say peoplehood, self-determination, statehood, those are the terms of international law. Let me be clear about that. That is the terminology of international law. You could say it sounds a little bit about like the 70s stuff. Yes, it does, but it became incorporated into law. And they won those rights. And no state will deny, I'm trying to think what's the current US position, but I don't think the US has officially said Palestinians don't have a right to self-determination. That has not happened yet under Trump. It may, especially if he wins a second term, but so far they haven't officially said that. That's the law. So when you ask the question, should they still use that terminology? Yes, because those are rights that they won. It wasn't bestowed upon them, because as I tried to tell you, objectively, it's not clear Palestinians are a people any more than it's clear that Brooklynites are a people. It's not dictionary definitions, it's power that wins you that recognition as not just citizens, not just a cultural group, but a people entitled to a state, those are things that are won in the field of battle. Now, it doesn't have to always be armed struggle. Battle can take different forms, but these are rights that are won in the field of battle. They won them. They are universally recognized, and they should not be relinquished, that is, given up, and they should not be forgotten. Put them in a little drawer in your desk. No, those were hard-won rights. So, of course, they should keep them. But it's a separate question, what should you focus on now? And I've said, but now I think it's too late. I've said for the longest time, what should be focused on is the blockade of Gaza. Because I think that has the broadest human appeal. And the illegality is flagrant. It's collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. No question, no argument, no dispute, case closed. It's the clearest cut case. There's a strange thing about left politics. It's always been a problem with left politics, which is, in my view, politics is always to look for the point of least resistance, the weakest link, and go for it. Weak, but also significant. I'm not saying weak and trivial. It's the weak link, but significant. There's been a problem always with left politics, but also Palestine left politics in particular. That's the one I know, which is you choose the point that's hardest to win and to show how pure you are by focusing on what's hardest to win. That never made much sense to me. Do you want to show the world how pure you are? Or do you want to have a practical victory, which will first be significant? I said not trivial, significant. First, it will be significant. And secondly, from the point of view of morale, it lifts people's spirits. It tells them we can achieve something. We can achieve something. And that gives them incentive to try another thing. But if you keep focusing on the point of hardest resistance and you don't achieve anything, what do people conclude? That it's all a waste of time. Politics is a waste of time. We can't do anything, forget it. It happened here, during the demonstrations against the police brutality. Unfortunately, these were young people who were very decent. They didn't have a clear goal. Okay, we're coming out in the street every day. Every day, every night. I was there, but I was the only one over 40 there, literally. Part of it was the COVID. But part of it is because the older generations are hopeless. That's a separate question. I was there every day. And it was clear we were marching, but for what? What's the slogan? What's the goal? What do we want here? And what typically happens, if you don't have a good leadership, a leadership which has experience, a leadership which is not trying to show the world how pure they are, but are really committed. They're really committed. When you don't have that, what happens? The people who sound the purest gain all the attention, the purists. So what became the slogan? The slogan became defund the police. Defund the police. It was a crazy slogan. Because if you're home at night and you live in the poorest neighborhood of the richest neighborhood, And a burglar, you see a burglar and they're entering your building, you want to call 911. That's our emergency number, 911. How would you like to call 911? They say, sorry, police defunded. It was a nutty slogan. So, I mean, there was elements of it that made sense, which was take a lot of this money that's going for the police and give it to youth programs. Yeah, that made sense. But that's not how people understood it. They understood it as no police. Okay?
But Mr. Finkelstein, Dr. Finkelstein.
So the point is, because you're talking about language, you have to use a language that's relevant to the era in which you live, and you have to look at slogans. You have to choose slogans which don't show how pure you are, but have a chance of winning. Because what happened? All those protests with George Floyd, they disappeared. They disappeared overnight. And you know why? Because people didn't know what we're going out marching for. It became taking down statues of Abraham Lincoln. Now, for God's sake, half these young people are unemployed. Half of them, 3/4 of them, are going to be evicted come November when the election is over. 51% of young people in the United States, they're still living with their parents at age 30. It's the largest percentage since our Great Depression in 1930. Sana, you'll be surprised. 25% of American young people between 18 and 24, 25% have contemplated suicide. 1/4 have contemplated suicide. So you think they're going to go out every day to kick statues of Abraham Lincoln? Is that what they're going to do? To kick statues of Abraham Lincoln? You need a slogan that can win. So now all the people who marched in those demonstrations, they think, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. And you know what they do? They start thinking about suicide again. And that's no exaggeration. I know the young people. I jog along Coney Island, the beach in New York, every day. It's now sprawled with homeless young people who sleep on the beach, homeless young people. Hopeless. And it's the same thing with the Palestine. So now I'll get back to it. Why do you make your litmus test? Okay, son, I use a scientific term. Litmus test. Why do you use the litmus test of the Palestinian right of return? It's the toughest right to win. I'm not saying you should drop it. You have that right. It's the law. You stick by that right. It's the law. You don't have to give it up. Well, why do you make it the litmus test? The toughest one to win. The one that will probably require the most compromises if you're going to get any of it, extract anything from it. Why do you do that? Because it has nothing to do with politics. It's about posturing, posing for the camera, sitting in your stupid internet terminal with your Facebook and your Instagram and all that other Twitter and all that other crap, and showing how radical you are, has nothing whatsoever with trying to actually improve the lives of a suffering people. Nothing whatsoever. No one says drop the right. The question is, do you want to win something that not only has real consequences for real people, but also energizes people? They feel like we can win something, and then they want to try to win more, and they want to try to win more. That's what politics is. It's about giving people real hope that mass action can change things. If they had had a concrete slogan during those George Floyd demonstrations, if they had a concrete slogan and we won it, then people would be out in the street again. Hey, we won that one. Let's try it again. Let's try it for something else because we won that demand. But then when it degenerated into kicking statues of dead people and messing up murals that were racist, listen, when you're contemplating suicide, you have bigger things to worry about than a statue or a mural. It was total nonsense.
I hear you, and I think this is something that we'll have to bring forward to our audience and discuss, like what should, like, because a big part of the audience will be talking about the right of return, will be ones talking about all or nothing, but I also recognize the benefits of the approach that you're suggesting here, and the added value of actually achieving something and raising morale and so on. I think we have to wrap up real soon, but I want to welcome Benjamin, who joined really late from Sweden, and Bilal had a question. I don't know, Bilal, if you still have that question.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if the question is already answered, but you talked, Mr. Finkelstein, about it makes more sense to talk about racism more than Zionism when you talk about a certain problem. Don't you think I think it's more like the reason why people talk about Zionism is because when they use the term Zionism, they implicitly think or sets the question about the legitimacy of the state of Israel. What do you think about that? Or do you think that the Israeli state is a fact? It's already there. There's no way that we ever soon is going to get rid of it. So let's move forward from here. What's your comment about that? Thank you.
My comment is, you can look at a question morally, you can look at a question historically, and you can look at a question politically. And those are three different things. And they often rest on questions of judgment. Now, I'm going to leave off with that because I have to also get to do some things. But I think one thing that people don't understand, I don't want to say people don't understand, that sounds very arrogant, presumptuous. I think one thing about politics which is often not seen, which is a different thing, is that politics is mostly about judgment. It's not about facts. It's not about history. It's about judgment. So I'll take an example, which all of you are familiar with. Professor Chomsky, he has a terrifying knowledge of facts. And it's always right at the front of his mind. I remember once somebody described it as a computer program. So they said, he's in a conversation, somebody says, Timor. He says, okay. He brings up the program Timor in his head. Another person starts talking about linguistics. He brings that one up and that one up. You know, it's like a computer, and then all the information is right there. It's spellbinding, it's dazzling, it's breathtaking, it's stupendous, it's a force of nature, it's an act of nature, it's an amazing sight to behold, okay? And so people think it's that faculty of Professor Chomsky's that makes him so, you know, in a class all his own. In fact, it's not true. It is not his encyclopedic knowledge, in my opinion. It's not. I knew him quite well. I had a lot of conversation with him. It's not that. Chomsky is a classical intellectual, old-fashioned, very old-fashioned. He takes students very seriously, he's obviously not anymore, but took his responsibilities as a professor very seriously. He used to set aside every Tuesday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., 12 hours just meeting students at MIT, took very seriously supervising theses. So all over the world, he created single-handedly. He created the discipline. It was not just because of his intellectual ability. He created the students. You don't know how many departments in the world, the professors, they studied under Chomsky, literally, physically studied under Chomsky. Even at Brooklyn College, a small school where I teach, I have two professors, young people, studied under Chomsky personally, including a Palestinian, by the way, he's a classical intellectual. And so he's steeped in all of Western thought, of philosophy, Western philosophy. He's contemplated all the great moral questions about life, its meaning, its purpose. And he's also, from a young age, he was engaged with politics. And his uniqueness, it does not come from his encyclopedic knowledge. It's not just the facts. It's how the judgment he brings to bear. What does seem right and fair and just, and what's not right and fair and just. Those are questions of judgment. They are not questions of fact. They're not even questions of law. Because Chomsky, when you'll say, okay, you say that, but the law says this, he says the law is stupid. He'll say that. Because he's powerful enough that he can negate in his person the law. So people will say, well, what about the law? And then another person says, but Chomsky said the law is stupid. And that's sort of like, there's no question. If Chomsky says the law is stupid, and Chomsky's right. So he has an advantage because of his authority, his moral authority. He can say the law is stupid, and that just cancels the law. If I say the law is stupid, they say, no, you're stupid. So I don't have that advantage. The point is, in my view, politics is a lot about judgment. And how you weigh these things. Weighing. Judgment means weighing. Arguments on one side, arguments on the other side. How do you weigh them? And I could say, if you asked me, no, there's no real moral argument that could justify Israel's creation. I think the proof of that is very simple. You know how you know for sure there's no argument that can support Israel's creation? Because the Zionist movement up until the present will still tell you there was nobody there when they came. It was empty, or effectively empty land. If they're telling you, if they're insisting that it was empty, do you know why they're insisting it was empty? Because they recognize if it weren't empty, what they did was wrong. The fact that they are so emphatic that the land was empty is the proof positive that they themselves know what was done was wrong. So if you ask me, as a question of history, can you justify it? No. As a question of morality, can you justify it? No. As a question of politics, changes. Then you have to use judgment. It's there, it's been there, it's accepted as a fact by virtually every country in the world as a fact. It's accepted. Is it politically realistic? Also, is it morally legitimate to speak about its elimination, destruction, abolition? I think as a political fact, as a matter of politics, the answer is no. That's my view. I personally wish that Syed Nasrallah, who I respect a lot, I wish he would use a language. I don't think, not necessarily a language that accepts the state of Israel. That's not possible. I recognize that. I'm not going to argue about that. But I wish he would use a language that would clarify exactly what he means by the destruction of the state of Israel, and not create a, let's just call it a misunderstanding of what he means when he talks about that. But here I will, respectfully disagree with Sana. You take someone like the historical figure Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in Russia, committed Bolshevik, committed Marxist, but at the back of his head, his brother was a revolutionary also, and was hung by the Tsar. He loved his brother, he revered his brother, and I think that was a large part of his motivation. Okay, you want to say it's Marx and the revolution? Yes, but I also think he thinks in his mind, this regime must be a complete abomination if it killed my brother, meaning the Tsarist regime. With Nasrallah, his eldest son was killed by the Israelis. He'll never talk about it. He doesn't want to personalize it, and he is a man of politics. But, I know Sana, who I've known for many years, she loves her son Tarek and her daughter Sarah, and if anything ever happened to them by an Israeli, I would never want to see Sana again. Nope. It would be terrible. She would hate the Israelis. Oh my God. I couldn't be around it. So I understand where Nasrallah is coming from. I could see it. I could feel it. As a person. But in politics, I guess you just have to get beyond it. And sometimes when he talks about destroying the Israeli state, and I know the anger. He was in South Lebanon. He's from the Shia. He speaks with the heart of the Shia of South Lebanon. That Israeli occupation, the 82 war. I know where the anger comes from. And I'm not claiming I would be any better in those circumstances. I'm not claiming. I'm just saying, as a matter of politics, weighing everything, I don't see the slogan of destroying Israel, getting rid of Israel. I don't see it. I don't think it's as a practical possibility, even though you can understand the history, you can understand the morality, you can understand the suffering, but somehow you have to try as best as you can as a political person to be a political person. And politics is about judgment. That's how I see it. So so if you ever ask me a question like that, or anyone else, I think you have to separate it out in its dimensions. Its moral dimension, its historical dimension, and also its political dimension. What's possible? Politics is about one thing: balance of forces. What is possible? What do you have that can achieve your goal? What are your forces? What's your balance of forces? What can you achieve? Otherwise, it's either morality or, unfortunately, when it comes to the left, it's mostly posing for the cameras or now posing for the web. It is. It's not politics. It has nothing to do with politics. That's all.
Okay, so I guess that brings us to our conclusion, because I wanted to ask you if you had any final comments, and the final session we will be conducting will be about activism, and I think we will be talking about social media activism. But it seems to me clear that you don't believe. Please correct me. It seems to me you don't believe in the power of social media.
No, there's a lot of confusion here. I'll just give you a quick example. BDS is not a goal. BDS is a tactic. Boycotts, divestment, sanctions, but the goal for what? What's your goal? That's not a political goal. It's tactics to achieve a goal. You have to tell people, we want you to boycott this product. Okay, why? For what? What's your goal? BDS can't be the goal. Same thing, social media. Social media is a means of communication. You still have to have a goal. Social media can't be activism. So social media is a means to achieve a goal. So to say to me, I don't believe in social media is like saying to me, I don't believe in a newspaper, or I don't believe in a book, or I don't believe in a pamphlet. Of course, they are means of communication. But when you start thinking that the communication is the goal, like social media activism, that's not politics. It's like Sana used to say to me, I'm not sure whether they want to liberate Palestine or BDS Palestine. I don't know what they want to do anymore. Do they want to liberate Palestine, or do they want to do BDS Palestine? And it's the same thing with social media. You talk about it as if it's a substitute for something else. It's a useful, sometimes not so useful, it's a useful medium to try to achieve a goal, but it's not a substitute for it. You're not being an activist. I can't see being a social media activist. I could see you use the social media as you use any means of communication to achieve a particular goal. That makes sense to me, but not a substitute. You're not going to liberate Palestine by sitting in a cubicle in Ramallah. That's just crazy.
No, of course it wouldn't be the goal itself. It will be a platform, and it would be inspired by the Me Too movement and other achievements that have been that the social media has brought the platform for, and we see very much how Israel are fighting and censoring.
It's the current means of communication. It's the current means of communication. I don't see turning it into something else, such that people think that they're Che Guevara if they wrap a keffiyeh around themselves and sit in a cubicle in Ramallah and denounce Norman Finkelstein as a liberal Zionist. No, I don't really think that's politics. I think it's stupid. I do. What do you want me to tell you? I think it's stupid.
I respect that. We've been taking.
You don't have to respect it.
No, but I really do. I really do. It's putting things in perspective, and it tells me that I also need to be aware of how I formulate the questions, but also how I bring this forward. Because, of course, bringing a lot of awareness alone isn't the goal. We need to have something concrete. So this is something that we will be aware of, and we will ask our audience to be aware of it.
The social media has been a complete catastrophe in terms of making people capable of how to think. Because you cannot put an idea in 140 characters. That's not an idea. Do you think Karl Marx wrote his Das Kapital on postcards? On postcards? There's no ideas. An idea is, I work on ideas. I'm not saying I'm Einstein. I'm not saying I'm Poincaré, but I work on ideas. Ideas are mentally strenuous. I get up in the morning. I don't want to get up. Oh my God, I have to work this out. I don't want to work it out. It's just so painful to have to work this out. I'll do anything. I say, okay, let me read another book, because I should read another book on the subject. But I know I'm just making an excuse because I don't want to go through the strenuous activity of working out an argument. It's very painful. And I got news for you. The more complicated the argument, the more simple it looks on a piece of paper, the harder it was to formulate. Believe me, the simpler it looks, the harder it was to formulate. You know how it is in the natural sciences? They talk about an elegant proof. What's an elegant proof? An elegant proof is a proof that's so simple. That's so simple. It's the same thing. Believe me, my stuff reads very simply, clearly, logically. Yes, follows. That was torture. Torture for a month trying to figure that out, how to present it. What's the social media done? You think you've presented an idea in tweets. There's no concept of an idea of working through a problem from start to finish. It's so strenuous mentally. And you think you've done something with a tweet. Okay, tweets can be okay. They're witticisms. They can be witty. They can be clever. They can be funny. I posted something, or Sana posted something the other day. I wrote about freedom of speech and Holocaust deniers. I could not believe the attacks I got. Never got anything like that in my life. It could have been the Zionists attacking me. The Zionists. Never read anything like this in my life. I have to tell you, the attacks were so funny that even though they were at my expense, I was laughing very hard. Sana sent them to me. I would never look at Twitter. But she sent me. I was laughing. They were so funny, the things they said. Most of them said something like, Finkelstein, I would suggest you don't write this book. Finkelstein, you should go to Bellevue, mental hospital. They were very funny. So a tweet, it could be witty. It could be funny. And I'm not going to deny it. It's not an idea, though. People don't think anymore. They want to reduce everything to tweets. That's not politics. Okay, that's what.
But politics is not the language of our audience. It's not the main language, and that's why we are taking these means into consideration. It can be somewhat frightening for them to have to go into politics. So that's why we're going into making music, protest, graffiti, poetry, and bringing Palestine on the agenda through other means, and through this engaging them in the debate and reintroducing them to the identity. I think we will take the last question from Mark, and then we will leave you, Mr. Norman, for your final remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Moody. Dr. Finkelstein, with all due respect, I think that you are underestimating the power of tweets. I mean, look at your current president. and your perhaps coming president. What I would like for you to answer, if you could, is from our position as grassroots organizations, we want to convey our message hard and simple to the public. And again, with all due respect, this is Europe, not America, because I understand there's a big difference from how we are educated, from our educational system, and from your educational system. I was asking you about strategies before, and I think that you gave us a lot to think about, saying that you don't have to go for the highest goal, even though it's your right. Go strategically ahead. Go, for example, and have the message, the slogan saying, "Stop the blockade on the West Bank and on Gaza and whatnot," and have your governments pressured to acknowledge the state of Palestine. Do you have any remarks on that? Because this meeting is, the objective of this meeting is, what can we do from an expert point of view like yourselves to convey this message to the youth, to the next generation?
Okay, look, I said, well, let's start with basics. Every movement needs communication because we want to build a mass movement. So you have to reach masses of people. So of course you need means of communication. And tweeting is a form of communication. And I think I clearly said, nobody denies its power, and it has there have been positive effects of it. But I also said, and I strongly believe, we should also look at its negative effects. And there have been many negative effects. Do you know 1 in every 3 people surveyed in the US said, young people, said literally, they have no friends. They said, I don't have a single friend. But if you go to Facebook, everybody has 600 friends or 1,000 friends. There is a kind of disconnect between the social media reality and the real world reality. You go into a restaurant with people, you don't talk to them anymore. The young people, they're already tweeting, texting. Is that a good thing? Is that a good thing? No human communication as against technological communication. So you have to look at the phenomenon as a whole. And one of the drawbacks I found is people no longer have an attention span beyond maybe 200 words. My publisher wrote to me, and he said that was quite a reaction to what you wrote, on the Holocaust denial and free speech. I said to him, yeah, I've never seen anything like it. I said to him, could you imagine what the reaction would have been if they had read beyond the headline? I don't think anyone read the article. They don't read anymore. To get back to your question, yes, social media is a means of communication. President Trump discovered that, well, with the exception of Fox News and some of the talk radio personalities like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, the whole establishment media is against him in a kind of fanatical way. Fanatical. He discovered he can use the tweets to get past all the establishment media. It was true. He can go around them. He doesn't need the New York Times. He doesn't need the Washington Post. He doesn't need any of the media. He can go around them and go right to his audience. He doesn't need them anymore. Yes, that was a big achievement. An important technological breakthrough for him, for anyone, that they don't need the mainstream media anymore. They can reach their audience. Professor Chomsky reached an audience of literally hundreds of millions, literally. But that was due to fanatical commitment over something like 50 years. You know, it took like 50 years for him to achieve what he did in terms of communication. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the young radical in our Congress, she was able to achieve what he achieved in maybe 2 months. 2 months because of that social media. So I'm not going to deny it. But here's the key point where I'll end it, because I have to move on in life too, as do all of you. You said to communicate our message. That's the key word. The key word is figuring out what your message should be. And figuring out what your message should be requires a lot of thought, a lot of experience, a lot of practical knowledge of politics before you could figure out what is the right slogan. What is, because we don't want to write textbooks for people, we're talking about masses of people who have jobs to work at and lives to live. What is that message? And as Sana will, I think, confirm, because we've been at it a long time, that's always been the issue. Should the message be BDS? Should the message be right of return? Should the message be lifting the blockade? Should we be talking about one state or two states? What is the message? And figuring out what the message is, it's not easy. It is not easy. It may look simple, 3 words, the Bolsheviks, 1917, bread, peace, land. May look very simple. What could be simpler than bread, peace, land? Well, you know what? It took a lot of thought, a lot of political experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of judgment to figure out that slogan. In my experience with the Palestinian struggle, they treat BDS as if it's a magical formula, instead of abracadabra or open sesame, it's BDS. It's just a magic formula. It's an incantation. It's not the product of strenuous thought, experience, weighing and judging. That's hard to come up with what's the right slogan. And so, yes, it's true. In many ways, positive ways, social media have facilitated communication. I recognize that. As I said, I think it has very negative effects. I spend a lot of time reading books. I know quite a lot of people who call themselves activists who spend all their time answering tweets. Literally, 12 hours a day just answering tweets. I personally, it's a judgment. I don't think that's the best use of time. If I were to answer every tweet insulting me, then I can kiss everything I've done goodbye. I never even look at my Wikipedia page. Never. I make a point, don't look at it, because I know it's going to get me angry and it's going to distract me. Don't look at it. Don't look at anything. I think God's wisest creature was the ostrich. Put your head in the ground, ignore everything around you, and do what you think is important. Because the moment you start answering, you get sucked in. And then you start counting shares and you start counting likes. And it becomes so obsessive, so obsessive. It's the drug of drugs. Don't go there. Stay away. But I'm not denying the positive. But the thing is what you said. You said what message we want to transmit. That's the hard part, the message. What do you want to say? And that's been the point of battle for people who are serious. I broke with BDS. I remember the day. I was lecturing all over the UK, and then I would meet with the activists afterwards. We only had one question. Where do you stand on BDS? And then when I started to give lectures, the first question, I could be talking about, I don't know, I could be talking about quantum physics. The first question, but where do you stand on BDS? I remember that. I'm way older than all of you, way older. I was a Maoist, a follower of Chairman Mao. Whatever anyone lectured on, they would come to my university, whatever they lectured on, my hand is up. Where do you stand on armed struggle? Where do you stand in the dictatorship of the proletariat? I wasn't listening to anything they were saying. I had my two holy of holies, dictatorship of the proletariat, armed struggle. Those were, if I can use a scientific term, the litmus tests. Whatever they said, my hand went up. Where do you stand in the dictatorship of the proletariat? Where do you stand in armed struggle? That's not thought. That's not thought. That's a cult. It's a cult. I was part of a cult, a political cult, but it was a cult. We had formulas. We had slogans. We had no thought. No thought. And there's a place for everyone. Not everybody has to be the thoughter. I don't want to say thinker, the thoughter, yes. But you have to have people who are seriously pondering these questions, and they're not reducible to tweets. That's how I see it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finkelstein. I think this is, I would have loved to wrap it up with the ostrich. That was a really good point, and it translated really well to Danish as well, but I think it was important to get the last part as well. I can't express how much I appreciate you coming on this session and wanting to share all of this with us. I hope that this will, that our audience will like this as much as I've enjoyed it. We will release this in a couple of weeks, and alongside this, we will also release a number of other videos that had been pre-recorded and documents, so they get some history on it as well. We will keep you in the loop, and hopefully you can also join for Q&A with our audience on Monday in 3 weeks. Thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us. Enjoy your day.
Yes, thank you.
And for all of you, the others, Sana, Ben, Mahmoud, and Bilal, thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, selv tak, bro.
Was gik hen? Nice, go.
Yeah.
Hello, Sana. Wasn't it I mean, it was a pleasure. What a movie. Bilal, what's Mahmoud?
It was a pleasure. And maybe I don't know if you heard the introduction. Sana is helping with Finkelstein's website, so he knows they know each other really well. I imagine she has a lot of these meetings.
Yeah, I do. But it was a pleasure listening to all your questions. And I have to say, although Norman has left, it's not that I agree with everything he said. We disagree a lot, especially on some definitions or some terms. But I will leave it for later discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sana, for helping facilitate this very, very much. I'll get back to you on email, and enjoy your evening.
You too. باي
باي سنة.
باي باي أهلا فيكم.
أهلا أهلا.
أهلا. باي.
Bye.
God, I skal klikke på.
Okay, vi